This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Jeffrey McCune, the award-winning author of Sexual Discretion, Black Masculinity, and the Politics of Passing from the University of Chicago Press. He is the co-editor of the Black Sexual Economies, Race and Sex in a Culture of Capital. He is presently completing 2 book projects, Disobedient Reading, An Experiment in Seeing Black from University of California Press, and a book of poetry entitled Pillar Talk. He has published in a variety of journals and also serves on the editorial board of numerous journals. He is the co-editor of the University of California Press's New Sexual Worlds book series for his work at the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality. Dr. McCune has been featured on Left of Black, SiriusXM's Joe Madison Show, HuffPost Live, NPR, Pitchfork, and as a guest speaker on Bill Nye Saves the World. In July 2021, he assumed the role as the director of the Frederick Douglass Institute of African and African American Studies, the University of Rochester. How are you doing today, Dr. McCune?
I am very, very well. Very excited to have conversations with you. This is an exciting podcast.
Well, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for making the time. We can dive in. How did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to the field of Black Studies?
Wow, such a great question. I often get asked that question, and I don't often know the answer, but I've been thinking a lot lately about just my long genealogy of Black Studies in my life. Right, I'm from Chicago, and so born and raised in Chi-Town, and in being in Chicago, I remember being in high school and seeing Black women on buses and trains. And I just became enamored with their kind of day-to-day, I would see these women, 4 and 5 children, ushering them to school, getting off the bus. And sometimes the children would be, acting out. Sometimes the children would be well-behaved. And I just wondered, I would actually ask, why do you have so many children? How is, life for you with all these children? Or I would say, why are you yelling at your children? Or why are they so disciplined? Why do you make them all wear the same clothes? I have all these questions. And for me, it was the beginning of what I call urban ethnography, right? It's asking pointed questions. I was in high school, so of course the questions were inappropriate, right? But they were also questions that were very much entangled at that time in how it was that gender was showing up in my life, and particularly mothering. And there was clear indicators that the most of people on buses and trains were these women with children, right? There wasn't a lot of fathers with children. And so I was just hyper-focused on this. And for me, that was the beginning of asking questions about Black life, and particularly Black women's lives. And of course, I'm also in that moment asking questions about my own life as a child of a single mother, right? And really, who later married, but for the early part of my life, my mother was a single mother, and I was trying to figure out, how do you do Black masculinity or Black boyhood under the guidance of Black women, mostly, right, in my family? And absolutely possible, right? And today I stand as a person who benefited greatly from not only Black feminist teachings, but Black women's everyday lives and experiences. And so that, to me, is why, in many ways, I anchor Black studies in the traditions of Black feminism and Black women's work, and of course Black queer folks' work as well, and Black queer women's work, and that is kind of like the beginnings.
So what keeps you committed to the field?
What keeps me committed to the field? It is life-giving. Black studies, to me, is a life-giving field. It is and encounter with a discursive and intellectual world that the academy has never known, right? And to arguably, I would say the academy still doesn't know it, right? And so it becomes this kind of hieroglyphic space, to be Hortense Spillerian about it, or it becomes this kind of like hieroglyphic space that the academy is still trying to figure out. Because I think largely what I'm committed to is making sure that Black studies is never understood as the diversification of the academy, but that it's necessary diversification of thought within the academy, right? And not just thought, but I would also say practices, right? And so, how do we really take seriously Black worlds and the construction of Black worlds by Black people, not always the ones that are constructed by white people for Black people. But how do we pay more attention to the worlds that we create, the kind of interstices and the larger worlds, right? That we create for ourselves through community, through activism, through various practices.
So that kind of leads into thinking about Black studies and maybe some of your academic background in relationship to disciplines, right? So Black studies is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, antidisciplinary, however you want to describe it, right? It is not constrained by the traditional boundaries of these things we call academic disciplines. So, how do you situate yourself in relationship to Black studies, and particularly leading a department, which means that you are in conversation and sometimes negotiation, right, with those boundaries on a very real level day to day?
Absolutely. So I think Black people, and this is not like rocket science, right? Black people are, by nature of how we live in the world, what we encounter in the world, interdisciplinary people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so those of us who come into the academy to do the work are really drawing from the life experience of being in multiple worlds at once because we have to. It's not a choice. It's not a hobby, a fun activity, right? It is actually the thing that we do because it is a part of our being. And so to me, right, bringing, multiple fields in conversation is actually, exposing the very nature of Black life. And for me, what I would say is the interest in this moment of building Black studies is pushing against any tendency to constrain Black studies, not only by discipline, but also by ideas, right? There are multiple ideas hosted by Black people in multiple communities, and amongst multiple constituencies. And I feel like what we have to be able to do is have diverse and robust conversations. And the only way to have the most rigorous, robust conversations is by engaging in rigorous research, which I do think is at the interdiscipline. And so for me, the rigor of Black studies and Black life is the interdisciplinarity of of Black life and the field of Black studies. So I would argue that there are many Black studies departments and programs that have been built through disciplines,
Mm-hmm.
right? The kind of like, representative discipline, right? You have a representative from each discipline in the department, and that makes a interdisciplinary department. What I think here at University of Rochester, the foundations of this department that I've been building since 2021, we have started with the idea that we wanted to hire and take seriously folks who could actually not be in any discipline because of the radical interdisciplinary work that they do. And I think that that is part of what I'm wedded to is how do we continue to push Black studies to be okay with being Black studies and not having to be philosophy, anthropology, political science, sociology, right? it is okay because actually we're being more authentic to Black people by actually engaging in these kind of interdisciplinary modalities.
So, building on that, and you can answer this to whatever extent you want to, but what has it been like building a department or putting together a department?
Brick by brick.
Yeah, at this particular moment in America's history.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a phenomenal whirlwind experience, if I'm honest. It's been very complicated because, of course, right, most people don't get the opportunity to build a department in their lives, right? Like, so this is a phenomenal opportunity that I take very seriously. And of course, right, I make mistakes along the way. That's what happens when you're building, right? And of course, when you're trying to lead people who are coming from various backgrounds, right, and yourself included. Um, but you pick it up and you do it and you correct and self correct and you hone in on the things that are working. And so what I know has been working, right, in this moment is to not listen to the naysayers, to also galvanize folks around the project enough
Mhm.
to make them support the radical interdisciplinary robust department that I'm trying to build with gender and sexuality as the anchor of the work, right? Right, and understanding that Black studies itself, right, has always been engaged in questions of gender and sexuality, right? So that doesn't make us a Black gender sexuality department. It makes us Black studies because Black studies, at its best, right, does all of these things, right? It looks at race, gender, sexuality, and class. Whenever I'm speaking, Dwight McBride, whenever I'm speaking race, I'm speaking gender, sexuality, and class, and I take that seriously as we build. And so what's been great is the institution largely has been interested in being a pioneer in this area and doing some really, really cutting edge work in terms of our hiring and in terms of our development. What I will also say, if I'm honest, since you asked me to be honest, I think there is a bit of misunderstanding amongst universities as to the cost.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is twofold. I actually do mean economic, like actual cost. The cost of hiring Black folks, right? It's an expensive task if we're going to do it well, because you have to hire at a rate where folks can have mentorship, where folks can be well supported, where folks can create community, right? And so it can't be, when I first came here, it was, Jeffrey, you got 2 or 3 lines. That's what you got. It's going to be you and 2 others, or 3 maybe, right? Maybe you can get it from joining with another department, right? And I knew immediately that we had to get some money.
Mhm.
And so we applied for Mellon funding, right? And the Mellon Foundation was able to give us a $3 million grant that would then help us expand the reach, right? Expand the possibilities of what Black studies could be. And I think oftentimes what happens in Black studies departments, in my experience, having been in, several, is the money gets funny and the
Mhm.
decisions are made relative to money. So people are wondering, like, why isn't there more graduate students? And people are like, y'all need more graduate students. It can't be just 3 of us in a cohort. Well, that's actually an institutional financial problem, right? Y'all need to really hone in on a strength area in your department. Right now, it seems like everybody's willy-nilly doing their own thing. But what about Black health? What about Black queerness and sexuality? What about global diasporic studies? Like, how can you build in multiple areas and have concentrated foci? Well, we don't have the money to build that way. So we got one person who does this, one person who does this, and one person who does this. And so it is a real strategy of building that one must have as they think about what is possible for Black studies and as an emergent field. But the other cost that I think we have to talk about, quite frankly, right, is literally the cost of the institution to change its culture, that cost.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that white folks, particularly, white institution builders, have to really understand that when you bring Black and brown folks into institutions where they are 2 and 3 and 0.5%, your project has to be increasing that number.
Mm-hmm.
Your project also has to be not just increasing, but increasing resources. Your project has to also be about increasing mentoring programs and possibilities. But here's the other thing that we don't talk about. Your project also has to be cultivating leaders. You know, I say this all the time, right? I was blessed to have really great mentors and folks who are leaders now in the academy, right? You know, Dwight McBride, E. Patrick Johnson, Jennifer Brody, right? Robin Means Coleman, like all these folks who are like, you know, now big wigs in the academy, right? And I would say that I learned a lot from them, but every institution is different.
Mm-hmm.
And no one could have ever told me, I live in my Black queer truth, but no one could have ever told me the cost of being a handsome Black queer man running a department and all the things that one becomes, right, subjected to. And part of what I think is really important is that institutions realize, who are you hiring? And it really requires some study. And so I'm always about, like, they always talking about like our departments need to do self-study. And I'm always like, your university needs to do some self-studying before it tries to do some really robust things. And as far as Black studies is concerned, it really has to be honest and serious about the lives that the institution is impacting when it recruits and hires. And so the costs are many. And so building Black studies, right, while it looks, you know, like people always say, like, oh my God, you make it look so easy. I said, yeah, it's not easy. It may look easy, but that is just the facade of it, right? Like the kind of, you don't see like the hours that I spent scaffolding or figuring out what the plan of hire was and figuring out what the, you know, the tenure promotion documents will look like, and all the things that not a one person said, Jeffrey, I would like to help you with that, except for outside my institution, because the institution didn't know that I needed those kinds of resources. And so instead of getting it at the institution, you got to get it somewhere else. And that is the kind of interdisciplinary work, or intertextual work, whatever you want to call it, that one has to do, across campus work, that one has to do to make Black studies what it can be. And I think we've done a good job of building a healthy community for our faculty, and we're building more and more every day. And so I love it. I love it. It's hard, but I love it.
Well, I definitely think that it's needed and necessary right now in a moment where, with increasing attacks on Black studies, having those spaces, both within institutions and outside of institutions, that are going to continue the work and push back
Absolutely
against all of the attacks, but also the traditional narratives. Like, one of the things that has been super insightful, right, about these conversations that I've been able to have has been the commitment that everyone has to Black people telling their own stories.
Absolutely.
Right. And Black studies being able to tell its own story is really important in this moment where even history that told partial truths in the past is being rejected. So, the complete fabrication of historical truths right now is really mind blowing. But Black studies has always confronted that. And I think that in this moment, having those spaces is more important than ever.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I think Black studies has not only just confronted it, right? I think it is the field that anticipates it.
Mm.
Right? And so, I mean, we anticipate a distortion. I mean, the reason why Black history comes into being is because we know that we can't trust people with our archive, right? The reason why ethnography, Black anthropology, Black sociology comes into being, right, is because we know that how sociology and anthropology as fields were telling our stories was incomplete, if not inaccurate. Right. And so you're right. Like we have to anticipate this moment that's coming where Black studies is going to over and over again be understood as a space that does diversity work. As if we have not historically been. I had to tell somebody this yesterday. Like this is an intellectual field. This is a cutting edge field still in this America. Right? It shouldn't be, right? Like it's like we still Black studies is still the cutting edge of the university, right? That is ridiculous, right? It should be a part of what we do, but institutions don't understand it. They understand it as the space where we get the most diversity at institutions. They don't understand the rigor of the work and the audacity for Black people to even take pen to paper to tell these stories, as you say. And I think that that's part of what is really fascinating to me about this moment is, I forgot who said it, and maybe it was Toni Morrison, but, this is the time when the artists do art, and this is the time when the writers write, and this is the time when the poets, do poetry, right? But it's not just that this is the time to do it. We have to do it because we anticipate the counter poetics, right? We anticipate, right, the counter narratives. So that is the doing of Black studies that I think is really valuable. And we haven't yet, I don't think that we've arrived at an academy that understands what it really meant. The old back in the day, Stuart Hall and others who would talk about, and Cornel West too, of course, would talk about, right, the Black studies as prophetic.
Yeah.
We thought it was religious, like, oh yeah, prophecy, religion, right? But it wasn't about that. It was about the anticipation of that which white folks and the white academy could never surmise. That's what's interesting to me. It's like, come on, Black studies.
So that I'm going to go out of order in my questions because that leads to the question of what excites you most then about the future trajectory of Black studies?
I mean, I'd be lying to say that I'd be lying if I didn't say it's young scholars. Like the new questions that are being asked, right? Folks who are asking pointed questions about even the canon of Black studies itself. People who are, I always tell people, like, I'm writing this book on disobedience, right? And it's all about, right, disobeying the canon and what the cost of that is, but also what the benefits are, right? And in some ways, that is the Black project, not even just Black studies, but that is what being Black is, right? Is radically being disobedient because we came here as non-citizens, right? And so what I'm anticipating and what I'm seeing is a lot of young folks who are actually disobeying the rules of the academy. Even in the construction of the book, how they tell narrative, right? The creative ways in which they're doing it. Now, I think we can, I think, when you want to be interdisciplinary, I think there's some other kind, there's some folks who I would say like, yeah, I understand you want to enter poetry there, but I would love for you to have like ran this through, right, folks who do poetry every day and think about that. yeah, I like your engagement with experimental theater, but like Lisa Thompson's down the street, right? Talk to her, right? Yeah, I understand that you want to kind of, do some theoretical, advancing. But first, let's remember that in 1968, Black folks were asking some of the same questions,
Yeah.
right? And so I really am excited about the young folks who actually, and the junior folks who actually do that work, right? They actually say, yeah, there's a place I want to go, but I realize that this is both in conversation with some historic work and this is a departure from some historic work. And so I get excited about that when I'm in my meetings with my junior faculty. Particularly I think about somebody like, Phil McCarris, who I think did an interview here. And, his vision of policing, I love that book, right? His book on policing definitely gives us an opportunity to think beyond policing, but he actually goes a step further and actually experiments with what that might look like counter to what we've been given. That's the work, right? And that's the beauty, right? I love folks who are doing this kind of like rich layered ethnography, right? That no longer means that if you're studying Black women, you don't actually think about the intersections, right? Of like there's nothing wrong with like if you're doing a project on Black women and HIV/AIDS, right? Not assuming that all those women are heterosexual, right? And deciding and thinking about what does happen when we inject or think about queer women and vulnerabilities to HIV/AIDS and queer trans women in that same conversation, Black women, right? Like I find this an exciting time. So the field to me is doing some great stuff, and I like the disobedience to disobedience, right? Like it's like that's what I feel like is happening, and so I feel the future of Black studies is disobedience and just a perpetual disobedience that gets us to a place where Black studies becomes an area where we actually can't define any individual in a department as, oh, you the historian, or you the this that person, or you the person who does public health, right? Like I want it where it's messy. It's messy, and you're looking at it and you're like, what is this? It's Black studies, baby. Right? And that's it. I ain't need to, oh, well, I do, I'm a performance scholar, blah, 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 I'm an ethnographer. I don't want all that. I want it where it's so messy and disobedient that it is not able to be defined. Because we are not philosophy. We are not sociology. We're not English. Right? And that is, to me, but it also, I'll say this, yeah, sorry, I'm going a little long, but like this is my, like, everyone knows this is my thing. It also requires quite a bit of rigor to do that kind of work.
Yeah, it does.
It's not like a pick up and go. Like it's not like you can just be like, well, I want to just be messy to be messy. And so this is where I actually think we can learn from Black queer life, right? Right? Because if you're really reading, right, that means you got to know some things.
Yeah.
But if you just, like pulling something from a hat and you just say one thing about something, right, and not have knowledge of the full constellation, you're just throwing shade, right? But I want folks to be reading. Shade has had its day. Right? Like throwing shade on the field or on fields, right? That's cute. But if you're reading, you're engaging at a different level of rigor. And part of that is what I'm interested in is, right? What does a trajectory of Black studies look like that is undefinable, but at the same time rigorous and robust and representative of deep study?
There is a lot to think about in the
I see you.
I think that the analogy of read as opposed to just throwing shade, I think that that's a really interesting way to think about it, right? Like having that context is necessary, and so
and contact, right?
Yeah,
Context and contact, right?
Yeah.
Like how you go talk about somebody and you ain't had no contact with them, right? You don't even know like the frame from which they are writing the thing that they wrote, but you just like, ooh yeah, Hortense. I don't know what she was talking about with those hieroglyphics. I'm like, wait a minute, did you understand the moment, right? Well, the moment that she was writing in, like this might be a different moment,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, so it's an interesting thing that I quibble with sometimes. There's a line in one of Hortense's essays, and I don't consider myself a Spillerian necessarily, but I do love her, right? Like, I love her as a person. And there's a line where she says, right, there's no love in slave time or something like that. I'm misquoting, but it's something like that, right? And one of my students was like, I really don't like that line. And I said, okay. You don't like the line. And she said, I think it's actually not true. Black people have their own way of loving, right? And I'm sure they did in slave time and blah, 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 blah. I said, but wait a minute. If she is trying to do a reading of slavery itself in the context of slavery,
Mm-hmm.
you might be reading it into the contemporary, like the afterlife of slavery, etc., etc. But perhaps this moment was a literal one to get us out of this idea that anytime Black people are incarcerated, that they can muster up a love that is recognizable by this American public, right? Right? Sure, I agree with you on the love thing that Black people do their own version of love and community and all this other stuff, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's true. But let's just take a moment to just give Hortense her context. And also let's make contact with her other work, which we know is really invested, right, in a certain kind of the kind of mechanism of slavery, the mechanics of it. And that's important, right? But I could have let that student just go off, right? I could have just let. And so I feel like that's the kind of like requirement and generosity that I'm always talking about. People, you know, some people hate me. They're like, Jeffrey, oh my God, you and this generosity. I'm like, if anybody deserves generosity, it's Black folk.
True.
You better understand the context and the conditions under which we live, which does not allow us to have a perfect life, does not allow us to have an obedience, right? Like so it is clear that we need greater critical generosity as we do this kind of critical work going forward.
I think that the critical generosity is a really simple way to put it, right? Like you have to put things in their proper context. Who was the audience for this piece when it was written? What was happening when this piece came out, or this idea or this conversation? Who was this written in conversation with, right? Especially if we're thinking about Black studies, like the long history of Black studies and like the debates between Du Bois and Washington, or the debates between Marable and Gates. Like these are, you take one of those pieces just by itself, you're missing that whole context. And like you said, that intellectual rigor and that contact as well as context is necessary in order to see the fuller picture and to be critically generous with your modern or contemporary interpretations.
Absolutely. And what does it mean that you're writing as the first and not the last?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like that is a big question, right? Like I always tell people all the time, like, look, dude, I am the first to do this thing at University of Rochester. I am not doing it as the last person to do it. I'm doing it as the first, which means that there has to be some relative generosity as to what happens in this context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because and Spiller, same thing. Others, right? Like you know, I have many critiques of Black queer studies and like the traditions of Black feminism and all these things that we can talk about. We can start there, but what we first have to begin is what is the conditions under which people are living if they have to be the first. like that's a big question, because it means that everybody who's the first knows that they're not the last. So it means that it's a beginning rumination.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go hard on a beginning rumination, what kind of generosity is that? Right? Like, this is the beginning of a construction plan. I can't see it 20 years from now. I might be able to see it 5, 7, right? But 20 years from now, there'll be somebody else sitting in this seat.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that when they look back and say how Jeffrey was doing it, I know that Jeffrey McCune was doing it as a first. Right? Like I hope that kind of generosity exists within Black studies. And I hope that it exists within Black communities, quite frankly, right? As we think about, our critiques of, our grandmothers and grandfathers and great grandfathers and great grandmothers and uncles and aunts and all these things, right? What does it mean that they were doing things as a first and not a last?
Yeah.
You know, you asked some good questions. You got me wrapped up.
Well, I think it's there are so many things that are coming from, there's so many more questions for me that are coming from the things that you're saying. But you talked about speaking with students about that critical generosity and acknowledging the context and thinking about what it means to read people who were the first at something. So building on that, how is your work as a teacher informed by Black studies?
Yeah, that's I really, sometimes wish I could do more teaching. Like I think of this as a podcast and like I think lectures and things and giving book talks and all of that as a part of the teaching that I do. And I also teach, classes here and there that are needed, right? Like so like
Mhm.
I'm at the point now where the director of undergraduate studies just says, yeah, Jeffrey, we need that hip hop course you got. Nobody's teaching that right now. Oh, we need Black sexual worlds, right? Like I'm like, okay, I'll teach that, right? But I don't get to be as innovative in terms of constructing courses at this point because I'm constructing a thing, right? A
Mhm.
department. Um, but what I think is always true for me is I am moving in the classroom to create spaces where Black students, particularly, and students of Blackness can live in body and mind. Like, I take seriously doing activities with students where they are engaged through some kind of physical practice, physical doing. I'll never forget my graduate students in Maryland, actually, where you are. They didn't understand. I was teaching this course called Black Cultural Currents, and I had them create this museum where they actually had to like show representative currents in Blackness, right? And this one student had people blindfolded, and like they had to have Popeye's chicken or KFC, right? And they were like, "Can you tell the difference between which one?" Right? And all the Black folks was like, "I know that's Popeyes," right? And it was that kind of material impact, right? People remember that moment, you know, a, you know, 2 decades later,
Mhm.
right? And I think that that's the kind of bodily memory that I want to create in the classroom so that Black studies lives with people and gives them processes for living as Black, right? And living with Blackness. And I think if students have these kinds of encounters, they learn in ways that they can't forget. Like it's one thing to give them books and give them articles, and of course I do that, a rich panoply of text and visual images and
Mhm.
performances and experiences, right? Ethnography, right? But I also believe that there's something about giving them the good old fashioned physiological engagement, like physical movement, that allows them to understand Blackness and Black studies in a different way. And so I've always been that kind of teacher. It is not, you know, everybody's pedagogical style, But that to me is how I bring what I understand as the materiality of Blackness and Black studies into the classroom. And I'll say this. I'm also always reading, so I'm always like, I wanted to bring the new folks, in the room. Come on, Savannah Shange, come on, JT Rome, come on, like I want to bring the folks, to my students, right? I want them to see and hear voices that sound like theirs, right? And that's one of the things that the challenge, right, is like, you know, I don't necessarily know I'm always writing, the poetry book maybe, but like disobedient reading, I don't think with my undergraduate students at least, when they read the text, they're gonna be like, yeah, I hear me up in there, right? I think there is a way in which, right, just who I am at this age, in this generation of the academy, it's going to speak a certain way, and so I want them to have encounters with those voices too, right?
Mhm.
And I want them to mark why the voices sound different, and they are equally important. But I also want them to hear, right, the less senior. I'm not making myself sound like an old man, but I just mean in terms of age in the academy, right? Like how I want them to hear the critical voices of folks who are doing, I think of someone like Will Mosley and others who are just doing the good work. I know you're University of Maryland, so I'm pulling all these people, but they are really, a treasure. And so I think that there's so many folks with whom I try to get my students to engage in so many practices.
Do you think that in this moment, so you talked about like having physical experiences, having that mind body connection, in understanding Blackness and living with Black people and being Black, what do you think in this moment is going to be necessary for the Black Studies classroom?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Whew. Child. Because I mean, the reason why I say this is a big question is because we all are facing what is allowable
Mhm.
in these universities that are responding to political and cultural shifts that often they don't even themselves understand, but they understand it as a political project,
Mhm.
right? They understand the lives of Palestinians as a political move to speak about the conditions under which violations are happening every minute, right? That is somehow to mark that is to do something inappropriate in an academy, in these universities. And I think that we are faced with how do we show up authentic and honest to the tradition of Black studies.
Mhm.
I got an email just yesterday about our postdoctoral fellowship, which has a theme of Black Palestinian studies and Black trans studies, right? And this person was like, I can't believe you would, in this moment, have such a fellowship, right? And this is about teaching too, right? And so, and I thought in this moment, what can I teach? What can I teach this colleague?
Mhm.
Just as I'm going to have to think of what can I teach these students. And what I had to teach is, to be honest, is to say this. Questions around Black Palestinians and questions around Afro-Palestinians and the state of Palestine have been a part of Black studies conversation since its inception as a field.
Yeah.
And so you, Johnny, come lately to this. You Johnny come lately. I'm not Johnny come lately. So as an intellectual, right, it's like asking me, you know, um, if I'm in English, right, why are you teaching the Scarlet Letter? Right? I'm confused. Hawthorne has been a part of the canon, I thought, since English is the field, right? Like, you get what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
what are we doing here? The questions. So I don't even when my students try to do this thing too, I'm like, wait a minute, you don't know the field. I know the field. And so part of it is that we have to really take authority, intellectual authority, right? I think that sometimes we don't know that we can actually not move towards political authority and say and have to have political speech. We actually live within Black studies. Those of us who teach in Black studies, we live within a interdiscipline that is itself by nature engaging questions of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so the intellectual project of the intellectual project of Black studies is always a political project. I don't need to tell you that, right? Like, right. It's always a political project. But our announcing of the politics is interesting to me at a moment where the political is understood as offensive and problematic. So it feels like we need to pivot and do something else. And so my pivot is, let's just hone in on the intellectual project of Black studies. Let's be honest about what the field is.
Mm-hmm.
Let's name it, right? Black trans studies, baby. When we talk about blues of mid-century, you cannot not talk about trans folks.
Right.
Right. Black queer studies. What you talking about? Oh my God, why are there so many, emphasis on Black queer studies? Well, baby, when we crossed the ocean, you created a queer context for Black life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we were forced here across the ocean. Let me just say that. But I mean, in this podcast, I don't need to do that. But so I feel like the classroom has to become a space where we hone in and really emphasize the nature of the intellectual project of Black studies, and that we don't need to apologize. Because I'm gonna tell you, right? Sociology ain't apologizing. Political science ain't apologizing. Philosophy ain't apologizing. Right? Religion and classics, religious studies, they're not apologizing. So interdisciplinary fields like Black studies and women gender sexuality studies and American studies, right? We don't need to be sitting up in classes apologizing or even posturing through some political unction, rather than understanding that we are actually doing intellectual engagement and intellectual work. And that's what it is.
So there is a lot that could be unpacked there. But I appreciate that answer. And the call to not be apologetic, to be unapologetically Black studies in this moment. I mean, honestly, you might as well, because it's not gonna having that apologetic stance is not going to change the reaction to the type of work that happens. So you might as well say it.
You might as well. And we're better for it, right? Because one of the things that, Pedagogy 101, right? Please come into the classroom your whole self.
Yeah.
Not partially, your whole self. And does that mean that you have to disclose everything about you? No. But it does mean, right, that you have to be true to your intellectual genealogy and your intellectual suspicion and your intellectual investments from the perspective of the field.
Mm-hmm.
And so you got a lot of resources. You got many books, many articles, many performances, many films. You just get so much, so many texts to draw from. And so sometimes to do the work, I will never forget, I was teaching last semester. So you asked about teaching. I was teaching 50 years of hip hop. And honestly, folks thought, this is going to be a course. You just listen to some hip hop music from the United States. And we go from, early hip hop to mid hip hop to late hip hop. Right? They were expecting all that. And towards the end of the course, I was like, okay, we in a moment right now of real tensions in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to hear what Israeli hip hop and Palestinian hip hop are saying What are these artists saying? Right? And the students were like, "Oh my God, Dr. McCune, why are you doing that?" Right? Oh my God, isn't this controversial? I said, "What's controversial? Does not Palestinian hip hop exist? Does not Israeli hip hop exist? Does not Black Studies also take up these questions of hip hop itself as a very dynamic and multi-porous kind of performance genre, right? Don't we do that? Like that's what we do. So the students couldn't say anything. They couldn't say, "Oh, Professor McCune is definitely, trying to promote some kind of, pro-Palestinian agenda." You know, it's like, no, that's not what this is about. This is about what. How is hip hop a vehicle? How is Black Studies a vehicle? How is Black performance a vehicle to talk about political issues, to talk about, disenfranchisement and colonialism and colonization, genocide?
Mhm. So that actually does relate to the last question, which I asked you the last question earlier. So I'm gonna go back to a question.
That's
before we
great.
jump. Um, but if we're thinking about the past of Black studies, right?
Mm.
And in particular, in this moment when we're, as you especially are building a department, but also as we are reflecting on 50 plus years of the field and it's the attacks that are coming, like what interests you most about that past in both critical and excited senses?
This is an excellent question to end on. And I've been thinking quite a bit about the methods of the past
Mhm.
meeting the moment. The methods of the past meeting the moment. And when I say that, what I mean is if we look at the orientation of San Francisco State 1968 and the community engagement that was happening in that originary moment of Black studies, if we look at the coalition building around disenfranchisement, marginalization that was happening, we need to return to some of those methods. We need to be Black studies in the community as much as we are in the academy.
Mm-hmm.
When folks are attacking Haitian immigrants, we need to be bringing to Haitian communities a clear understanding of what is happening in the discursive moment and its implications. We have people who do that work, but we also know it, right? We know it, even if that's not your primary area, right? Like there's a conversation we need to be having within the Black community about immigration. And it is Black studies that can engage the community. Black studies of the past understood that the resources given unto us in the institution had some possibilities outside the institution.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just taking my paycheck and figuring out how to like donate things to the community, right? It was about like, how do we do partnership with community-based organizations? How do we bring activist voices, folks who actually are entangled in the mess of the politics of which we, oppose, to the campus so that we can hear other discourses, right? Other conversations that the academy has yet to really wrestle with, right? How do we talk about Black trans women's issues and men's issues without actually engaging with Black trans men and women on the street in all types of geographies?
Mm-hmm.
right? How do we address public health, black health issues? We're hiring in black health right now, right? And as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, we can't hire somebody who doesn't know the community, that doesn't have a community engaged perspective, right? That doesn't dialogue with the community to come to conclusions.
Mhm.
We can't just have people who are armchair theorists, willy-nilly making up stuff, right? And so the methods of the past need to meet the moment. And I think it is in methods, our approaches to Black studies, that we might come closer to something akin to greater Black liberation in thought and in practice.
Thank you. I think that that is a great note to end my questions on. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I just want to say thank you, because I do think that the Black Studies podcast itself is another form of doing and thinking about. It is its own archival project that is important, right, to capture generations of voices, different perspectives. And so I really, really thank you for being a visionary. Thank you all for being a visionary in creating this space.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for being on today. It's the end of the semester. I'm going to give you your time back, but we greatly appreciated having you. And as always, I learned a ton and have all these thoughts now from the conversation.
Well, live with it. I will live with it too. I'm thinking my brain is spinning. So thank you so much.
Thanks.